There are moments in history when entire civilizations believe they are living in the most advanced stage humanity has ever seen. Moments when technology is rising, cities are expanding, information travels instantly across the planet, and people assume the future will simply continue upward forever. Yet every empire that ever believed this has eventually discovered something unsettling. The end rarely announces itself with a loud explosion, but rather with a signal, subtle at first, almost invisible, a pattern that appears again and again across centuries, across cultures, across civilizations that rose to power and then slowly collapsed under the weight of forces they did not fully understand, which raises a disturbing question that echoes through both ancient prophecy and modern history. What if our world has already begun broadcasting the same signal that once marked the end of other eras? Throughout history, societies have always believed they were permanent. The Romans believed their empire would last forever. The great dynasties of China believed the mandate of heaven guaranteed their rule. Powerful kingdoms in Europe believed their power was divinely secured. And yet history tells a different story, because every empire eventually entered a strange and predictable phase near its end. A moment when political power became unstable, when economic systems began showing cracks, when moral and cultural confusion spread through the population, when technology advanced faster than wisdom, and when people started feeling that something was changing in the structure of the world itself, as if an invisible threshold had been crossed. What makes this pattern even more intriguing is that thousands of years before modern historians documented these cycles, ancient texts were already describing them, especially within biblical writings that speak repeatedly about periods when the world enters a phase of dramatic transformation. Moments when systems collapse, new powers rise unexpectedly, and humanity faces a crossroads between order and chaos. Passages that were written in symbolic language filled with images of beasts, kingdoms, collapsing stars, and strange global shifts. Imagery that many readers throughout history dismissed as purely metaphorical, yet which becomes strangely relevant when compared with the patterns historians now recognize in the rise and fall of civilizations. One of the most fascinating aspects of biblical prophecy is that it rarely describes specific dates or simple predictions. Instead, it reveals patterns, cycles that repeat themselves across long stretches of time, especially in books like Daniel and Revelation, where powerful kingdoms are symbolized as beasts rising from the sea. Empires expanding across the world, dominating global systems, before eventually collapsing and being replaced by something entirely new, a pattern that mirrors the sequence of world powers recorded by historians, from ancient empires in Mesopotamia and Persia to Rome and beyond, suggesting that the real message of these texts may not be about predicting one single moment in history, but about revealing the structure of how eras themselves rise and fall. If that interpretation is correct, then the most important question becomes this: what signals mark the moment when an era begins to end and a new one prepares to emerge? When historians examine the final stages of past empires, they often discover a combination of warning signs that appear almost like a repeating code embedded in the structure of human civilization, a code that includes extreme concentration of power, rising global instability, the rapid spread of new technologies that reshape communication and control, growing distrust in institutions, economic systems that become increasingly fragile, and a population that feels simultaneously more connected and more uncertain about the future than ever before. Conditions that sound strikingly familiar to anyone observing the modern world. Consider how quickly the structure of global civilization has changed in just a few decades, with digital networks connecting billions of people, artificial intelligence beginning to influence decision-making systems, financial markets, operating at speeds beyond human reaction time, surveillance technologies capable of tracking movements, transactions, and behavior across entire populations, and political tensions rising between powerful nations competing for influence in a world that is becoming more interconnected and more unstable at the same time. Two ancient writers observing these kinds of transformations through symbolic visions. Such global shifts would have appeared almost supernatural, because they describe systems where power could reach across nations instantly, where economic control could influence entire populations, and where political authority could operate on a scale that had never existed before. Imagery that once sounded impossible but now echoes eerily within the technological systems shaping our modern reality. This does not necessarily mean that ancient prophecies predicted specific modern inventions or events, But it does raise a fascinating possibility that those texts were describing the kinds of global conditions that appear whenever humanity approaches a turning point between historical eras moments, when the structures that once organized the world begin to reorganize themselves into something entirely different. In other words, the signal marking the end of an era may not be a single event at all, but rather a convergence of patterns that slowly intensify until the old system can no longer sustain itself. And if we look closely at the modern world, we can see many of those signals growing stronger. Global power structures are shifting as new nations rise, while older powers struggle to maintain influence. Economic systems face increasing volatility as debt, inflation, and digital currencies reshape financial stability. Information spreads faster than truth can be verified, creating confusion and polarization across societies. And technology is capable of reshaping human identity itself, from artificial intelligence to genetic engineering, developing at a pace that forces humanity to confront ethical questions no previous generation has ever faced. At the same time, many people across the world report a growing sense that history itself feels accelerated, as if the timeline of global change is compressing, with events that once took centuries now unfolding within decades or even years. A phenomenon that historians sometimes call historical acceleration, yet which ancient writers might have described in far more symbolic terms as the birth pains of a transforming world. This idea appears repeatedly in prophetic language that speaks of periods when chaos intensifies before a new order emerges. Moments when old structures collapse, not necessarily because of a single disaster, but because the conditions sustaining them slowly disappear, leaving space for a completely new system to take their place. History shows that these transitions are rarely peaceful or predictable. When the Roman Empire entered its final centuries, few people living inside its borders realized they were witnessing the end of an age that had defined the world for nearly half a millennium, because to them life still continued. Cities still functioned, governments still ruled, and yet beneath the surface the structural foundations of that empire were already weakening, until eventually the system that once seemed permanent simply fragmented and transformed into something new. This raises a powerful and unsettling possibility for our own generation. What if the most important historical shift of our time is not a single war, election, or economic crisis, but the gradual emergence of a signal indicating that the global era humanity has known for centuries is beginning to transition into something entirely different? A signal that is not hidden in secret codes or mysterious conspiracies, but visible in plain sight through the patterns of history, the acceleration of technology, the instability of political systems, and the growing realization that the world we inherited may not operate the same way for the next generation. For thousands of years, ancient texts have warned that humanity periodically reaches moments when its choices shape the direction of the future more dramatically than at any other time, moments when civilizations stand at a crossroads between renewal and collapse, between wisdom and chaos, between the preservation of human dignity and the creation of systems that could ultimately control it. The question is not whether change is coming, because history guarantees that every era eventually transforms. The real question is whether humanity will recognize the signal in time to understand what it means. Because if history has taught us anything, it is that the end of an era rarely looks like the end while it is happening. It simply feels like the world becoming more uncertain, more unstable, and more unpredictable, until one day people look back and realize they were living in the moment when everything began to change. And if that moment is unfolding now, then the most important message may not be a prophecy about destruction or fear, but a warning about awareness, a reminder that the future of civilization is not written by fate alone, but by how humanity responds when it finally recognizes the signal. And perhaps that is the real transmission hidden within the patterns of history. The signal does not tell us exactly when an era will end. It only tells us when the world has begun to change. And right now, that signal is getting louder.